when you remove that first area of defense and you no longer have a human performing that function, you got to ask yourself the question, well, how can I provide oversight, protection, safety, and security for my site?
Hey everybody, and welcome to the Industrial Security Podcast. My name is Nate Nelson. I'm here with Andrew Ginter, the Vice President of Industrial Security at Waterfall Security Solutions. He's going to introduce the subject and guest of our show today. Andrew, how's it going?
I'm very well, thank you, Nate. Our guest today is Michael Almeyda. Michael is a Senior Account Manager at Force5, and Force5 does physical security for electric utilities, and physical security is tied into cybersecurity. You don't have cyber if you don't have physical. So he's going to talk about physical security and the connection to cyber.
All right, then let's jump right into it.
Hello, Michael, and thank you for joining us. Before we get started, can I ask you to say a few words about yourself for our listeners and talk about the good work that you're doing at Force5?
All right, Andrew, thank you so much for bringing me on your podcast. Honor to be here. My name is Mike Almeyda. I'm a Senior Account Manager at Force5. I've been with the company for about 5 years. Altogether in the power utility space, I'm entering my 13th year in here. I had a previous career in the United States Army as an officer for a number of years, and my career stems from being a SIP auditor, working for a power utility, and now working for a vendor at Force5. We focus on reducing risk at every entry point of a power utilities facility. So thanks again for having me, Andrew.
That's great. And our topic today is physical security interacting with or supporting industrial cybersecurity. You know, we're the Industrial Security Podcast. Most of what we talk about is cybersecurity. How does physical security fit with cybersecurity?
It's a great question, Andrew. And I'll tell you, at the crux of the matter, physical security really ensures that you're keeping the bad actors out of your facilities. You're doing your best job to validate that those individuals have a business need, that they've met your site-specific training, they meet all your policies before they come on site. And it's important to limit who comes on your site because therein lies the problem, right? The first part of any type of criminal or bad actor is always looking to circumvent your physical security process. And with the right tool set and the right skill set, once they get inside your facility without being challenged, that gives them the opportunity to get to areas of your facility that house critical infrastructure protection components, especially when we talk about cybersecurity. This could be network cables, switches, routers, you name it. The moment that they get the physical access into your site, cybersecurity is just a keystroke away, right?
So in principle, that makes sense. I mean, I agree with you. Can you give us an example? I mean, how much trouble can we get into?
Yeah. So this actually it brings up a funny story, not really funny, but a really important story, understanding why cybersecurity is so important. So as I mentioned in my introduction, I did spend a number of years in the military and I was deployed. This is back in 2008. I got a phone call from my brigade communications officer about 2:00 in the morning. And she told me, this is now a declassified operation, but we had to disable every single USB drive across all of the computers in my area of operation. And at the time, I probably had over 2,000 PCs, and I was geographically dispersed in 9 locations in Iraq and had 24 hours to do it. My soldiers and I completed the mission, but the reason we had to do that is because there was a signature of a malware that was attempting to send information from our secret internet protocol to Russia. And what we discovered in our after-action review was that it appeared that the virus or the Trojan horse originated from a USB stick that someone had plugged into our network, whether it was advertently or inadvertently. More than likely, it was probably a soldier who went to the Morale, Recreation, and Welfare Center to go and talk home, contracted the virus on that device, and brought it back and put it into our secret computers. But the reason I bring this story up and the importance of it is if you allow just about anybody to come onto your site without properly vetting them and making sure they meet those credentials, they can easily take a jump device, plug it into one of your network switches, or plug it into a computer that controls some of your industrial control systems, and wreak havoc, just like we experience, which, by the way, set us back about a decade in terms of technology. So I would absolutely consider that something you should look at when deciding whether or not you want to let the right people in on your site.
You know, Andrew, when it comes to somebody physically at a plant, it's not even something that I really associate with cyber. I just assume that a cyber attack occurs when some remote entity tries to get in through technological systems, not when somebody's literally at a plant. Is this something that happens outside of the context of like Stuxnet? And if so, are there any defenses against it?
Yes, yes and yes. Let me give you sort of a more mundane example to start with. I was working at Industrial Defender a long time ago. We were, building software, and we had to test it. And so we had a large test bed, and to standardize our testing, we would reset the entire test bed to sort of a known state between runs. And that meant taking, Linux CDs, and we'd taken image backups of the hard drive, basically, every sector on the hard drive from zero to as big as the hard drive was. And, between runs, we would just put the image back on the hard drive and start from exactly the same state. So we had to do this. And, I gave the Linux boot CD and all of the backup CDs to one of my colleagues who'd never done this before, explained how to do it, went away. 2 hours later, he comes back and he says, Andrew, do you know that with this Linux boot CD, I can boot any device in the office here and read all of the data off the hard drive? I said, yes. I said, welcome to the dark side. If you can touch it, it's yours. Now, this was back in the day before hard drives or flash drives were routinely encrypted. So to your answer, is it real? Is it mundane? Yes. Back in the day, you boot into Linux and you can read every bit on the hard drive. Nowadays, this is why the modern world, modern equipment is encrypted. The hard drives are encrypted. If you try to do this, you'll get garbage back. But the bad news is that not all of the equipment in industrial control systems is modern. A lot of it's still older. And, even modern equipment is vulnerable. If you can touch it, you have a huge advantage. So sort of a second example is Chinese intelligence agencies have been accused of doing this to visitors in China. People who visit China are encouraged to use throwaway devices and not log into any of their important cloud-based systems while they're visiting. Why? Because Chinese intelligence agencies have been accused of tapping the hotel on the shoulder, tapping your business partners that you're there to visit on the shoulder, saying, take this man out for a 3-hour binge somewhere, and then tap the hotel on the shoulder, get into the hotel room, look at the laptop, figure it out, and leave. Do it again the next day and come back. And this time they know exactly what model laptop you have. They've got the tools. They take it apart. They insert a device, a very tiny device between the keyboard controller and the motherboard. And now this tiny device is recording all of your keystrokes. They come back at the end of your visit and do the same thing, removing the device, putting your device all back together again. And now they've got on that little chip all of the keystrokes that you've entered, all of your passwords that you've used in the last 3 days. They log into your systems and, you're sunk. So, and in the modern world, this is why many of the cloud systems, if you want to log into them, have two-factor authentication. So to your question, yes, if you can touch something, you have a huge advantage in terms of compromising it. And yes, this is why we see two-factor authentication. This is why we see encrypted hard drives. This is why we see a lot of modern technology being applied, because this is a real problem.
So can we talk about, that's the problem. Can we talk about the solution? I mean, it sounds simple. Is this not why we have guards, gates, and guns?
We absolutely do, Andrew. We have guards, gates, and guns, but I can tell you that with the recent financial economical strains, especially on big businesses, it's becoming more challenging to borrow money. And so what I've seen recently, especially one of my large customers, is that they've made a decision to move away from a contingent guard force because the cost is astronomical. And at the end of the day, they're beholden to their shareholders. And so when you remove that first area of defense and you no longer have a human performing that function, you got to ask yourself the question, well, what can I do? How can I provide oversight, protection, safety, and security for my site if I don't have somebody that's looking over them? And you know this, Andrew, being in the power utility space, power plants are it's the bread and butter of how power utilities not only make money, but allow us to flip a switch and let the lights go on. So if we can't afford to allow a physical person to do that, we have to do something different. And that's one of the reasons why at Force5, we provide solutions for outage management and really help provide internal controls that can vet individuals, making sure that they have a proper business need, they're not on some watch list, they have your site-specific training, so you have confidence knowing that individuals who come on your site not only are who they say they are, but have the appropriate business need and also meet all the training and policies you've set in place to protect your organization in the first place.
If you've got organizations that have done away with their guards, I mean, what happens if, worst case, someone ignores your security fence, brings a saw, cuts through the fence, cuts through the doors on the way into the plant, into the server room, I don't know, with a USB in his hand. Do you not need guards at least for incident response? I mean, what do you do if you don't have guards and you've got a situation like this?
Right. And this ties back into your incident response plan, as you just mentioned, right? So the first thing you have to do is if you know you're going to move away from a contingent workforce or contingent guards, you have to make sure that your policies and procedures adapt to that, right? If your policies and procedures say notify a guard and obviously you're not using guards, you need to make sure that there's something in place to follow. And really, it boils down to your level of risk tolerance, right? Do you really want your employees confronting somebody that they think is a bad actor? Or would you probably want them to do something like call 911, or call a security company, whatever it is? And more than likely, your SOC has probably done both already because they have videos. Most power utility companies I know have video footage pointing at those critical facilities. And so if they see somebody that's not recognizable, they're probably going to go ahead and start putting in their the protective controls to make sure that they do that. But the truth is, the more realistic situation is somebody finding a way to get into your site during a major outage so they can blend in with the environment and do things being undetected.
So that makes sense in principle. If there's an intruder in the site, there's no guards, you call 911, you call the authorities. Your SOC might have done that for you. But there's operational decisions that have to be made. If someone has, cut into the server room, if someone is wandering around the facility with a hammer in their hand, and with clearly malicious intent, they've cut their way into the facility. The authorities aren't there yet. Do you keep generating power? Do you keep producing oil out of the refinery? Isn't there a decision point that has to be made about what do we do if someone's on site like that? Do we have to shut down out of safety?
It's a really, really awesome question, Andrew. And I guarantee you're going to hear different answers from different people. But I can tell you, Mike Tyson had this famous quote, and it says, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth, right? So when you think about that, at the end of the day, your policies, procedures, your business continuity plan should absolutely have those steps in there. And if they don't, really, it comes down to the station manager. It's his decision on what to do in that scenario. I guarantee you, Your executives are probably concerned about profitability and are also concerned about making sure that the plant generates money to keep the lights on. But in that moment, the plant manager might be about safety and security for his employees. And so at the end of the day, I think the responsibility falls on the plant manager, whether he continues to have operations going or he chooses to shut down. And there's a lot of factors considering that, right? If they're in a, let's just say this happens in the summertime and it's at the peak of day and it's hot and you're at your peak load, you probably don't want to shut down your site. But if it's something that happens in the middle of the night where it's not really a peak load, there probably will be more considerations to actually have the plant shut down while you deal with the security issue. That makes sense.
Okay, something else you've said a couple of times, you talked about outages. Now, the questions I've been asking you, I've kind of been assuming we're talking about physical security during operations when there's, the usual complement of people on site, when you've got power coming out of the power plant, when you've got, gasoline going through the pipeline. You've talked about outages a couple of times. Why are you talking about outages? What's special about them?
So outages are something that commonly occur for large generation facilities. So if you think about a car, right, every so often you've got to bring your car in for maintenance so that way it keeps running. Well, power plants run on the same schedule. There are certain components of those plants that have to shut down for maintenance. And so during these times, you can have a large contingent workforce coming on site. In fact, there's a plant that I visited not too long ago, produces about 3,400 megawatts of generation. And at their peak outage, they can have about 1,500 people on site that are contractors that you don't know them, they don't know you, but they were there to perform a service for a certain period of time. And so when you think about having a large group of people, you don't know anything about them, all over your power plant, around your most critical assets, that creates a security challenge. It also creates a safety challenge because they've probably never been on your site before. Sometimes they have to bring vehicles on your site. So now every person and every vehicle that's on your site creates a liability, unless you find a way to validate them and ensure that they have a proper business need. So it's important. This is an important part of the power utility space because if those plants don't get everything done that they have to get done on outage and they have to extend their outage for any reason, it puts strain on the bulk electric systems on the interconnects as a whole, because now someone's got to pick up the slack for the power that's not being generated. So again, yes, it's a for-profit industry that generates power for dollars, but at the same time, if you can't fulfill your obligations, how the whole entire landscape is expecting you to, then it puts unnecessary strain on the system as a whole, and that can create issues like rolling blackouts and whatnot, which we all remember from 2003. But that wasn't due to a plant outage. But the point is, we have to make sure that during those outages, we're getting everything done that we have to keep the system online, and we're also making sure that safety and security is a focal point of ensuring that none of those contingent workers are going to be in a position where they can do something to sabotage or inhibit your ability to provide services to your customers.
Let's talk NERC CIP if we can. You're giving the power plant example. Let's say part of the outage is to expand the capacity of the server room so we can put more servers in there to do more stuff, more predictive maintenance, more whatever. And so one of the people who's got to go into the server room is an electrician. They're setting up the new rack or 3 with uninterruptible power supplies. They're connecting it to the power. They've had to add some new breakers. They're in there working for a couple of days doing electrical stuff. But this is the room that contains all of our control system computers. How does that work? The plant is down. It's not producing power. Do you just let the electrician in there? What's the rule?
Yeah, it's a really important rule. And this is right in CIP 6. When you have somebody, you have a critical or you have a physical security perimeter that's defined in NERC CIP. There's two ways you can do it, right? If this is a contingent worker that you know, that you've done a personnel risk assessment on, you've performed a 7-year background check, they have a valid business need to be in that space unescorted, you most certainly can give them privileges to go into that space unescorted. In my history of being not only an auditor, but working for a power utility, this is going to be the exception, not the rule. And the reason is because this is somebody that's doing work or service for a small period of time, and they're not going to be back. And so you typically want to reserve those types of authorized unescorted physical access for people that you trust that are going to be there from a longevity perspective. More frequently, what we see is when you have a visitor coming into a physical security perimeter, or PSP for short, you have to escort them at all times within line of sight. So you've got to make sure you document what their name is, who they're there to see, document what the reason is for them being in there, what time they arrived, what time that they left. This is typically done manually. From probably say about 80% of utilities do it manually. But again, that creates a challenge, right? Because if you have sloppy handwriting or you're not putting in the correct information, and there should be an event, then you're relying on what's written on that paper to see who was in that space, who was the escort, to try to decipher what happened. I can tell you that there's been a lot of times on the physical security side where an incident's happened, and when they go back and try to figure out who's in the space, they couldn't decipher the handwriting. So now they have to go and rely on cameras and rely on different angles and talk and call up the person who they believe is in the video. And as you're doing that, it's taking time. And the more time you take, the more likely whoever it is that was doing the malicious act probably is going to get away with it and be undetected.
Just a word of clarification here. Michael has mentioned the NERC CIP standards a couple of times. NERC CIP is a family of standards. It's got 13 or 14 volumes. And the standard that's called CIP 006, CIP 006, talks about physical access control. It says stuff like, if you have an important a piece of the electric system that is covered by NERC CIP, that's medium impact or high impact, because there's sort of three categorizations, low, medium, and high in the NERC CIP. If it's medium or high, you have to have a process that restricts physical access to these systems. It's usually described, colloquially as a 6 walls rule. You have to have a floor, you have to have a ceiling, you have to be sealed, floor and ceiling, and on 4 walls. You have to have a system in place, keys or technology or something that prevents random people from walking in. You have to have a way to, they use different words, but you have to have a way to clear people who are allowed into it. If you let people in whenever they want, they have to be trusted people. So they need to have background checks, they need training, they need to know what they're doing. If you have uncleared people, like the electrician who needs access to the space, they have to be supervised constantly by a cleared person. You have to have technology in place to monitor if somebody enters the room who's not authorized. You have to have alarms in place to detect unauthorized access. All of this, is part of CIP 006 because to a greater or lesser extent, if you can touch a system, you can compromise it, or you certainly have a tremendous advantage in terms of compromising it.
The latest numbers in the 2023 threat report on OT cyber incidents show that the threat environment has changed fundamentally at the beginning of this decade. OT cyber attacks with physical consequences have changed, from a theoretical problem to a very real problem, more than doubling every year. The new report is focused on deliberate cyber attacks in the public record. These are attacks that cause physical consequences in process industries and discrete manufacturing. Most of these attacks are ransomware, though the fraction of hacktivist attacks is growing. And the report's appendix includes a complete list of all cyber attacks since Stuxnet that meet these criteria. To see how today's OT cyber threat environment has changed, I invite you to download the report, a joint effort between Waterfall Security and the ICS Strive OT Incident Repository. You can download the report at waterfall-security.com/2023 cyber-threat-report. Or just go to the resources menu at the Waterfall Security site and click on white papers and ebooks.
So let's get into the details about the good work you folks are doing at Force5. You have solutions in this space. What do you have? Who's using it? How does this work?
So we got started, ironically, in the SIP space. I actually worked for a utility company, and I discovered Force5 at the recommendation of a peer. And at the time, we're talking about SIP 6 here, we were in, when there was 8 regulatory regions at the time, we were in all of them. And so we had manual paper logs at these physical security perimeters. And as you can imagine, we were getting audited by all 8 regional entities, and we would probably get audited every year. And it's something that we consistently had a problem with. And so when I approached Force5, I said, hey, listen, I'm going to make your business requirements very simple for you. I want an appliance that includes software and hardware. I want it all in one. I want something that can easily be used regardless of the austerity of any type of environment, whether it's a power plant, it's a substation, it's a control room, it's a corporate lobby. I want the look and feel to be the same, and I want a dedicated support line. I don't want to have to figure out what the hardware needs to be. You figure it out for me. All I have to do is pick up a phone or send an email and get help. And that's how Gatekeeper was birthed. And so we now have an automated solution, which is the only escort-driven self-service login kiosk in the industry today that enforces those policies of NERC CIP at your PSPs. And so instead of relying on paper, handwritten errors, trying to decipher that, we have the ability to enforce your policies and procedures. So whoever the authorized escort is, he or she is the only person that can use the system and start a visit. Your visitor can't. We put all the onus on the person with the responsibility. And that's how we got our start in NERC CIP. And then I'd say about a year and a half later, we were approached by a plant manager who said, hey, that's great, but I don't care about those requirements. I have hundreds of people coming to my site during an outage. They don't need to be escorted. I just need to make sure that they have met all the training. They're not on some sort of watch list, that they have a business need to be there. If you can figure that out, then I see a path for your solution. And so Force5 worked with some of the outage coordinators and some of the plant superintendents and plant managers. And that's how the evolution of the outage management solution of Gatekeeper was birthed. And so in this scenario, we use full height turnstiles. We can provide a building or no building. And we augment those turnstiles with our kiosks to perform access controls. And so if you think about what's important to a plant manager, they want to make sure that this person has the site-specific training to enter the site. They want to make sure that they're not on some sort of watch list or have been terminated or kicked off a plan in the past. And they want to make sure that they have a valid business need during an outage. So when you take all those pieces and you assign them to an identity, our kiosks, in a quick moment, when you use biometrics, they can either use their fingerprint or they can use their face. Once they come to the kiosk and identify themselves, the system does all those checks quickly. And if you meet all the criteria to enter the site, we fire the turnstiles. And if you don't, we deny entry. And if you match our watch list, not only do we not deny entry, but we send out emails, text messages, and robocalls to interested parties, letting them know that somebody that's a bad actor is at the front gate of your facility.
And, you mentioned biometrics. I mean, it's great. Biometrics are high tech. Are they necessary? I mean, most places I go, they use badges.
Right. Necessary and necessary are definitely good questions. So I can tell you that for your trusted environment, badges are okay. And they're okay because you know who the people are, and you know that they have already been validated by your company. When you talk about your untrusted environment, which is the reality here with a contingent workforce, in my experience in my career, I've seen a plethora of things happen. In fact, one time when I was working for utility, I happened to be at a plant, and there was a large group of contingent workers with a leader. Like, there was a contingent workforce leader that was overseeing all those people. And towards I'd say after lunchtime, this gentleman grabbed all the badges from his staff and let them out. There was another outage happening not too far away that they had a contract for, and the priority for that company was that those staff be there. And at the end of the day, when he went to go swipe out his badge, guess what he did? He not only swiped out his badge, but he swiped out the badge of his entire team. And so for our company, we wound up paying for 10 to 12 individuals that left early, right? So with badges, the problem with that is all they're intended to do, access control looks at the card serial number, makes sure that it matches an authorized entry on that list and lets them in. When you use biometrics, it's very hard to fake a face or a finger, right? So you have to have something physically that's unique to you. And so what we found is not only does it expedite the process of logging people in, but it also gives you stronger validation knowing that the individual who presented that credential, whether it be facial recognition or biometric fingerprint, when you have them presenting that credential, it's a higher confidence of validation. So you know that they can't hand their thumb and they can't hand their face to somebody else because you can only use it to go in and you can only use it to go out. And the system is smart enough to know if you've went in one time, we're not going to let that same identity in because it's already in the system.
It sounds like that scenario that you gave there with the badges, the benefit that the system was providing the plant is not really a security benefit in the sense that it's, keeping out people who shouldn't be there. It was kind of an operational benefit. And, in a sense, this is commonplace. A lot of folks that we have on talking about different approaches to solving problems in the industrial security space, a lot of the time, those approaches have sort of ancillary operational benefits. So, you've given us one. Do you have other examples of how you can use what appears to be a security tool to, just make the plant more efficient?
It's funny you say that, Andrew, because one of our customers recently this year gave us an interesting story I'm going to share with you, where we always tell our clients, make sure that you tell your contingent workforce when you use a solution is for a safety and security perspective, because they'll be more apt to adapt it in everyday routine. But one thing that he shared with me was he's always used this same scaffolding company for a long period of time. And over the years, he said he thought he was getting billed or overcharged for certain type of activities they were performing. And he could never validate it because for T&M or time and materials contractors, it's paper-based cards for time cards, timesheets, right? So he'd say 50% of the time he'd argue back and he'd win, and 50% of the time he'd pay the invoice. And so as soon as he leveraged our solution, he got his first invoice from the company. And when he looked at it, he said, this doesn't seem right. And so he decided on his own accord, you know what, I'm going to go into Gatekeeper and look at the resources that I got for the week. And what he discovered when he put his invoice alongside the record of who had actually been on the site, the invoice was for nearly double the amount of individuals he had on the invoice. So let's just say it was 40. He only got 20. And they were supposed to work 40-hour shift for the week, and they only worked 20 hours. And so when he went back to this guy, he said, hey, I got your invoice, but I'm not paying it because you overcharged me. And the guy's like, come on, man. We always go through this conversation every time we have an outage. I won't do that to you. And he said, I get it. I said, but I just pulled my report from the solution that we have for safety and security at our gate, and I can tell you down to the second who was on my site. And I can tell you that I got half the resources on this invoice at half the time. So I'm not paying this invoice. And the gentleman's like, well, let me look into that and find out what the problem is. And the next day he calls him back. He goes, oh, I sent you the wrong invoice. I apologize. Here's the right one. And he kind of, my client kind of chuckled, but he said ever since that scenario happened, he never has gotten overcharged for an invoice because they now look at this as a timesheet. So again, it's a safety and security solution, but the contingent workers looking at it as a timesheet. And in addition to that, one of the things he's been able to discover in using the data that was typically stale written on paper, now that it's in a database, he actually can predict whether or not he's going to have enough resources. As I mentioned earlier, if you don't have the resources to meet an outage and you have to extend it, that puts some strain on the power system. Well, using this solution, he can say, well, I was supposed to have 40 resources at 40 hours a week, but for the past 3 weeks, I've only had 20 resources at 20 hours. So he can predict that he's going to fall short in that area and maybe do some other methods to help condense that time a little bit shorter, or bring in additional resources to compensate for the lost time that he had because he didn't get the resources he was promised. So that's an operational thing. And one other story that I want to embellish here for a moment that I think is important is the security aspect. And I think this is operational because operational risk is something that everybody should consider, especially when you have industrial control systems. We had a customer who had a contractor that got into an incident with the plant manager. And as a result of that incident, he was placed on a watch list and walked off the site and told that he was not allowed to come on that site ever again. A few weeks later, that contractor decided to go work at a different site for the same company, the same utility company, just under a different outage. And it just so happened when he arrived, the watch list identified him as being a person that shouldn't be on the site. And that plant manager happened to be there that day because he worked the zone. And so he looked at that individual, says, don't ever come back to one of my plants ever again. You're not allowed here. And as a result of that, the vendor company he worked for terminated his services because he could not perform it. So lo and behold, several weeks go by, this individual gets a job at a new vendor company that happens to have a contract for an outage at the same power utility company. And when he showed up for the outage and placed his finger on the reader, it detected him. Regardless of what uniform he wore, we were still able to identify that this is the same individual that's on the watch list. He should not be on site. So the customer was extremely happy because there were 3 use cases in a span of 6 weeks where an individual who was someone that should not be on site was caught and was identified prior to allowing that individual to get on site. So that's a great example of the robustness of a solution. So safety, security, financial reconciliation, any of those things are important to your plants.
The point that Mike just made definitely speaks to what's been sticky in my mind throughout this interview, which is that the technology that he's describing seems most useful to me, or rather most commonly useful, not necessarily in that crazy state-sponsored like Stuxnet scenario where you're dealing with spies, but where you're dealing with more run-of-the-mill insider threats, which I imagine are going to be much more common for customers of his. Although it occurs to me as well, I don't know if I'm misunderstanding the exact nuances of the technology here, that it might make more sense to have like a list of people who are allowed on a site and then just exclude everybody else by default, rather than having like an expressly bad list and then going from there, unless there's a good and a bad list.
In my best understanding, and I didn't quite ask the question this way, but in my understanding, there are both an allowed and disallowed list. It's not like you allow everybody except people on the disallowed list. You don't let any stranger into the site. My understanding is that before you let someone in, they have to be entered into the system. You might presumably enter them into the system when they arrive, but presumably assuming they have someone to vouch for them, their host at the site. But even if you have an allowed list, the biometrics, I think, come into play. When you have a disallowed list, you've got biometric information for the people that are disallowed. In the example of the worker who changed vendors, they might well have, I imagine they could have registered with their new employer with a subtly different name. using a nickname instead of the long spelling of their full name, and they show up as a different name, a subtly different name, working for a completely different employer, making their first visit to the site. So they are on the allowed list, but then the disallowed list catches them because of the biometrics, identify them as the same person with a different name who's been banned from the site.
Cool. Some very convincing use cases. Let me ask you, we've been talking about what you folks do. Can you talk about the future? What's coming in this space?
Well, I think, and this is kind of ironic because we've talked a lot about visitor management and how we ensure the right folks come on site. But more recently, there's been a lot of shootings at substations. In fact, last year, I think it was over 113 shootings at substations. So it's definitely got the attention of a lot of executives in this space. And as a result of that, we've partnered with a company, and we're now producing what's called BOSS. It's a ballistic overlay shield system. And the intent of this is to provide enhanced ballistic protection, security, and resilience for substations and critical assets by reducing those potential attack vectors and threats, right? So you think about that room that we talked about, that hypothetical room with all this network and security equipment being shot at now is a physical threat. But again, you damage that equipment, it creates a problem. And so we've developed a solution based out of I think it's polyethylene is the proper pronunciation, but it's been tested by the U.S. military for over 2 decades. But the solution we have now can stop a 7.62 round, which is typically fired from a 308 Winchester hunting rifle, or an AK-47. So as you look at some of these threat vectors and threat actors, that type of caliber and lower is probably what they're going to use to target your substation, whether it's just a disgruntled worker trying to get back, or really somebody that's trying to do damage. This is a big threat that we're seeing that has certainly got the attention of many power utility executives. And we feel like in our ability to call ourselves a risk company, this certainly fits the bill when we talk about how do we reduce risk from those type of attacks at some of the most critical systems like transformers or whatnot in the power utility space.
There you go. I mean, distressing that this is the world we live in, but it is. I mean, this is why we have jobs. Physical security, cybersecurity, they interact. Thank you for joining us and providing these insights. Before we let you go, can you sum up for us?
So at the beginning, Andrew, we were talking about tying physical security and how it relates to cybersecurity, right? So if we take cybersecurity at the crux of it, that's the place where you can predominantly do the most damage undetected in your facility. And so if you know that that's one of the higher risk to your facility, to your infrastructure, you want to make sure that that is protected from a physical standpoint. And taking cybersecurity back to physical, if I had a handful of takeaways, here's what I'd tell you. Understand the risk that you have to your environment and what your tolerance is for it. If manual processes like paper, you're willing to accept that risk, then this is probably not for you. But if someone's circumventing your security, getting someone like an electrician to a switch room where you've got problems or you've got critical infrastructure that if it gets damaged, can cause a big problem, you probably want to automate it. And when you look at automating it, you want to make sure that you can validate, enforce, and discover things about your organization, right? So you log the visitor, you validate their identity that they have an appropriate business need to do that. You enforce your policies and procedures, and you discover trends about the information that you're getting. If this sounds like something that piques your interest or it's a need at your power utility, visit force5.com. We only work with power utility companies, or feel free to reach out to me. You can find me on LinkedIn. Just look up Mike Almeyda, the same name you see in the podcast title. Andrew, thanks again for having me on today. It's been a pleasure.
Andrew, usually I ask you for a last word here, but this episode has given me a lot to think about. I think that the overall takeaway for me is that physical security is dovetailed always with cybersecurity, that they are necessarily interlinked. And when you don't have the former, you can't have the latter. And also, we've done over 100 episodes of this show. I think that we sometimes take the physical security side for granted by talking about, everything else that happens on the computers as if that is just going to be taken care of. But at the end of the day, you need people like Michael to do that basic assumed implicit work, so that then we can talk about the more sophisticated defenses that we spend all our time on.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the principles that I talk about at conferences sometimes, we talk about the cyber perimeter. A lot of people say, "Oh, but the cyber perimeter, is it dead?" Because there's experts on the IT side say the cyber perimeter is dead, and I come back with yes, but, and it might be dead on IT networks, but that's not the point. The point is that all important industrial facilities have a physical security perimeter. All of them. They all have, if not guards, gates, and guns, at least, a fence. And, a system like Force5 at the turnstile, letting people into and out of the site, controlling access to the site. There's always a physical perimeter. You don't let the public walk into a dangerous facility. And you certainly don't want, random malicious actors walking into a dangerous facility. So yes, absolutely. There's always a physical perimeter. It's essential to cybersecurity. You don't have cybersecurity unless you have physical security. So, good call.
Well, thanks to Michael Almeyda for speaking about this with you, Andrew. And Andrew, as always, thank you for speaking with me.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you, Nate.
This has been the Industrial Security Podcast from Waterfall. Thanks to everybody out there listening.